Hey everyone, today we're going to step into my shoes. Well, my worn out little boots, and see the world as I did over a century ago. Imagine growing up in a place where simply being born a girl meant you were expected to keep your head down, marry young, and spend your life cooking, cleaning, and raising children. That was the Poland I knew in the late 1800s, still under Russian control, where even the Polish language was forbidden in schools. But inside me was this stubborn spark, the kind that refused to go out. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to my channel to support me making more great videos. Wherever you are right now, maybe it's late at night in New York or early morning in Hanoi, settle in and picture this moment in history. Now let's listen to my compelling story in this video. I was born Maria Skłodowska in Warsaw in 1867, the youngest of five. My father was a physics and mathematics teacher who had lost his job when the Russians cracked down on Polish educators. My mother, a school headmistress, died when I was just 10 years old, and my eldest sister followed soon after from typhus. Grief came early for me, but so did an unshakable love of learning. Even as a little girl, I was fascinated by the strange tools in my father's cabinet: barometers, thermometers, magnets. I'd sneak them out and pretend I was conducting experiments, even though most of the time I was just measuring how fast the cat could run away from a thermometer. But I noticed something important. The world around me was full of patterns, invisible rules, and mysteries waiting to be uncovered. The trouble was, in Poland at that time, higher education for women simply did not exist. Girls could only study enough to be considered educated ladies, which meant music, literature, and maybe a little arithmetic. If you wanted to learn real science, you were on your own. I remember once at about 15 walking past a group of older men arguing about electricity. They didn't even notice me hovering there, but I knew more about the subject than half of them. Still, I kept quiet. Speaking up would have been, well, let's just say not appropriate for a young lady. Inside, though, I was boiling. Why should I have to hide what I knew just because I was female? But here's the thing. When the system says no, clever people find a side door. Warsaw had an illegal network called the Flying University where students, men and women, could meet secretly to study forbidden subjects in Polish. These classes would fly from one location to another to avoid the authorities. I begged to join, and once I did, it felt like I'd found my tribe. We talked about Darwin, Newton, and Pasteur as if they were family friends. I drank it all in, memorizing details, working problems late into the night by candlelight. Still, I couldn't ignore reality. I needed a way to pursue formal scientific training, and Poland wasn't going to give it to me. My family wasn't rich. In fact, we were scraping by. I worked as a governess for several years, tutoring children in the countryside. It was decent money, but my mind was elsewhere, on the dream of Paris, the Sorbonne, and the laboratories I'd read about in books. Those years as a governess tested me in ways I didn't expect. I learned patience, I learned to stretch a tiny salary, and I learned how to keep hope alive, even when my future looked like a blur. Sometimes I'd walk in the fields at night, staring up at the stars and thinking, one day, I will study the light they give off. One day, I will know why they shine. The truth is, my love for science wasn't just about curiosity. It was about freedom. Science didn't care whether I was rich or poor, male or female, Polish or French. It only cared whether I could prove my ideas. In a world where almost everything about me was judged, that was intoxicating. By the time I was in my early 20s, I'd made a pact with myself. Whatever it took, money saved from tutoring, long hours, even hunger, I was going to Paris. That's where the real education was waiting. But I also knew that the journey ahead would not just be about mastering formulas or handling beakers. It would mean stepping into a world that wasn't built for someone like me. A young woman with a heavy accent, empty pockets, and a fire in her chest. I didn't know it then, but those years of quiet determination, of studying in secret, of working without recognition, those were the foundation for everything I would later accomplish. If you've ever felt like the world had already decided your limits before you even started, you'll understand why I had to push back. I wasn't just chasing a career. I was chasing the right to exist as I truly was, a scientist. And so, with my mindset and my heart ready, I began to plan my escape from the narrow world that had been drawn around me. Paris was waiting. But first, I had to find my way there without losing myself in the process. If you want, I can now move straight into section 2, where Marie Curie secretly studies in Warsaw and finally leaves for Paris. When you make a promise to yourself, it's funny how the world starts throwing both obstacles and opportunities your way, usually at the same time. I decided Paris was my destiny, but destiny doesn't buy train tickets or pay tuition. For years, I worked as a governess for the Jarowski family, teaching their children while watching the life I wanted slip further into the distance. The Jarowski estate was beautiful. Rolling fields, a big white manor. But beauty can be a prison when you're not free to leave. Every day, I'd give lessons, smile politely, and then spend my nights buried in textbooks, my fingers ink-stained, my eyes burning from candlelight. Physics, chemistry, mathematics, subjects I wasn't supposed to master, but I did anyway. And then there was him, Kazimierz Jarowski, the son of the family I worked for. We fell in love. He was brilliant, studying mathematics, and for a short while I imagined we could build a life together, two minds united. But his family refused the idea outright. A penniless governess was not a suitable match. He didn't fight them. That heartbreak was a quiet one, the kind that makes you steel yourself. I promised that the next great love in my life would be science, because at least science wouldn't care about my dowry. During those years, my sister Bronia and I made a pact. She would go to Paris first, study medicine, and I would send her money from my governess work. Then, once she graduated and found a stable job, she would help me get there. It took years, but slowly, painfully, we made it happen. Every coin I earned from tutoring and teaching, I sent to her, all the while keeping my own mind sharp in Warsaw's underground network of learning, the Flying University. The Flying University was my real escape hatch. It met in living rooms, attics, anywhere the police wouldn't look. We'd whisper the names of professors like they were passwords, pass notes that looked like harmless letters but contained complex equations. There, I could be Maria the student, not Maria the governess. It was intoxicating, finally being seen as a mind rather than a maid. By 1891, the waiting was over. Bronia had kept her promise. She sent me a letter with just a few words. "Come to Paris. Your room is ready." I still remember packing my suitcase in Warsaw. I owned exactly one good dress, 2 pairs of shoes, a winter coat, and a stack of notebooks. That was all. The rest of my luggage was determination. The train ride to Paris was a blur of excitement and fear. Every mile I traveled felt like I was shedding an old skin, leaving behind the girl who had to hide her intelligence. When I finally stepped off at the Gare du Nord, the noise, the smells, the sheer size of the city hit me like a tidal wave. It was Paris, messy, alive, and utterly foreign. My sister's apartment was small and drafty, but it was ours. She warned me, "The Sorbonne is no place for the faint-hearted. You will be the only woman in some classes. They will stare at you. They will doubt you." She wasn't wrong. My first day at the university was like walking into a men's club where I clearly didn't belong. Professors avoided my gaze. Male students chuckled when I asked questions. But I didn't care. I was there to learn, not to make friends. The reality of Paris was harsher than I'd imagined. I had almost no money, so I lived on bread, tea, and an occasional egg. I studied in an unheated garret room where I could see my breath in the winter. I wrapped myself in every blanket I owned and kept my ink from freezing by tucking it under my arm while I wrote. Hunger and cold became background noise. What mattered was the work, the lectures, the experiments, the hours in the laboratory. And oh, the laboratory. The first time I smelled the faint metallic tang of chemicals and heard the hiss of a Bunsen burner, I knew I was home. My professors, some reluctant to acknowledge me at first, slowly began to see my potential. I absorbed knowledge like a sponge, often staying in the library until the janitor kicked me out. It was in those cold, lonely years that I learned something vital. When the world underestimates you, you have 2 choices. Prove them right or prove them wrong. I chose the latter. Every exam I aced, every calculation I nailed, was my quiet rebellion. By 1893, I earned my degree in physics, first in my class. A year later, I earned a second degree in mathematics. That should have been enough to make me feel triumphant, but for me, it was just the beginning. The world of science was vast, and I had only just set foot in it. I didn't know it yet, but a man named Pierre Curie would soon walk into my life, and together we would chase discoveries that would change history. But before that came a harder truth. My education had freed my mind, but it hadn't freed me from the prejudice waiting outside the lecture halls. If I wanted a career, I would have to fight for it. The real battle was about to begin. Paris may have given me knowledge, but it didn't hand me a career. Once I had my degrees, reality knocked loudly. There were few positions in science, and fewer still for women. Laboratories weren't exactly throwing open their doors to someone like me, a young foreign woman with no connections beyond a handful of professors. I took whatever work I could find, teaching in the evenings, tutoring children, and eventually securing a small research job studying the magnetic properties of steel. The pay was barely enough to cover rent and bread, but at least it kept me in the world of science. And truth be told, I preferred a poorly heated lab to a comfortable parlor. Still, the prejudice was suffocating. In academic meetings, I was often ignored unless I spoke with the precision of a textbook. At conferences, I'd stand at the back while men shook hands over my head. Sometimes, I'd hear them say, "She's here because she's pretty," or "She won't last. Marriage will take her away soon enough." I learned early that I could either be offended or be too busy proving them wrong to care. I chose the second. It was during this time I met Pierre Curie, a quiet, kind man with a mind as restless as mine. We were introduced by a colleague who thought we might collaborate on a project. At first, Pierre seemed almost shy, as though speaking his ideas out loud might scare them away. But when he talked about physics, something lit up in his eyes, and I recognized the same fire I felt when I spoke about my work. Pierre was working on crystals and magnetism. I was studying steel and thermal conductivity. Our interests overlapped, and soon our professional meetings became long walks by the Seine, where we talked about science, life, and the strange ways the world tried to box us in. He didn't see me as a woman scientist. He saw me as a scientist, full stop. Meanwhile, my living conditions remained brutally modest. My garret room in the Latin Quarter was so cold in winter that water froze in the wash basin overnight. I often went to bed hungry, wrapped in every piece of clothing I owned, my hands stiff from the chill. I worked through colds, headaches, and the constant ache of malnutrition. If you've ever been so poor that every coin has to do triple duty, you'll understand how those years felt. But here's the strange thing. I look back on that time with gratitude. Hardship stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only my stubborn determination and my love for discovery. It was then I realized that science wasn't just a career for me. It was my refuge, my rebellion, my proof that I belonged in a world that didn't want me. When Pierre asked me to marry him, I hesitated, not because I didn't love him, but because I feared losing my independence. Marriage, for most women I knew, meant the end of personal ambition. But Pierre was different. He told me, "Whatever we do, we will do together." That was the condition I needed to hear. We married in 1895 in a simple ceremony with no white dress, no jewels. My wedding outfit was a dark blue dress I could wear later in the laboratory. Our life together was far from glamorous. Instead of a honeymoon, we bought bicycles and took a summer trip through the French countryside. We pedaled down dusty roads, camped under the stars, and talked endlessly about science. Those conversations would soon lead us to a subject that would consume the next decade of our lives: radioactivity. The idea was radical and still mysterious. Henri Becquerel had discovered that uranium emitted invisible rays, but no one knew exactly why. Pierre and I decided to investigate. We began experiments in a small, drafty shed that had once served as a medical school dissecting room. It was damp, poorly lit, and freezing in winter, but it was ours. Every day, I wore the same worn lab coat, my hair tied back, my hands stained with chemicals. We worked like this for months, often skipping meals, scribbling notes, and carrying sacks of pitchblende, a heavy black mineral ore, into our lab. Separating its components was exhausting, back-breaking work, and the pay was non-existent. But neither of us cared. We were chasing something new, something no one else had seen. And yet, outside that little lab, the prejudice remained. Even when our early results began to look promising, many in the scientific community dismissed them, doubting my competence and crediting Pierre for my contributions. The truth was, Pierre and I were equals in every sense, but I had to work twice as hard just to stand on the same ground. What they didn't know was that their doubt was like fuel to me. Every snide remark, every skeptical eyebrow, those were just more reasons to succeed. And if we were right, our discovery wouldn't just silence them, it would change the way we understood matter itself. By the end of 1897, I was on the verge of something extraordinary. I had given birth to our first daughter, Irene, and returned to the lab almost immediately, still wearing the determination I'd carried from Warsaw. I wasn't just a wife or a mother or a woman in science. I was a scientist about to pull back the curtain on a secret the universe had been keeping for billions of years. Shall I move on to section 4, where Marie and Pierre make their groundbreaking discoveries of polonium and radium and face fierce skepticism? If you've ever stood at the edge of a mystery, so close you can almost touch it, you'll know how Pierre and I felt in 1898. We were knee-deep in sacks of pitchblende, a mineral richer in uranium than anyone had worked with before. But here's the strange part. After removing the uranium, the leftover residue was still more radioactive than the pure uranium itself. Something else, something unknown, was hiding inside. We began the grueling process of chemical separation. Imagine stirring boiling vats of acid, inhaling toxic fumes, lifting heavy containers of crushed rock. This wasn't delicate, white lab coat work. It was industrial, sweaty, and endless. Day after day, we reduced ton after ton of pitchblende to smaller and smaller samples, chasing an element that didn't yet have a name. When I finally isolated a faintly glowing substance, I decided to name it polonium, after my homeland, Poland. It was my quiet rebellion against the Russian rule that still gripped my country, an invisible flag planted in the periodic table. But polonium was only the beginning. In the residue from the residue, we found something even more astonishing, a substance so intensely radioactive that it seemed to radiate energy from its very soul. We called it radium. It glowed faintly in the dark, a soft bluish light that felt like magic, and science had shaken hands. You'd think the world would celebrate us. Some did, but many didn't. The idea of new elements born from radioactivity was radical, and plenty of scientists doubted our findings. Her measurements must be wrong, I heard more than once, as if Pierre couldn't possibly have checked my work. Others questioned whether a woman's name should even appear on the research papers. I ignored them. The data spoke for itself, and I was fluent in its language. Still, the work was brutal. Our laboratory was a drafty wooden shed with a leaky roof where the floor turned to mud when it rained. In summer, the heat was suffocating. In winter, our breath fogged the air. My hands were rough and burned from handling acids, my nails perpetually stained. We didn't know then that the very materials we were handling, without gloves, without masks, were slowly poisoning us. We only knew that the work had to continue. There were moments of wonder, too. I remember one evening, after hours of exhausting labor, Pierre and I turned off the lamps and saw tiny pinpricks of light sparkling from our radium samples, like stars in a jar. It felt as if we were holding a piece of the universe itself. In 1903, our efforts were recognized, partially. The Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Henri Becquerel and to Marie Curie, but not to me. It wasn't that I hadn't been considered. Rather, I hadn't been considered at all. My name had been left out entirely, despite my being the lead author on much of our research. It was Pierre who protested, writing to the Nobel Committee to insist that my contribution was equal to his. Only then was my name added, making me the first woman ever to receive a Nobel Prize. That recognition was sweet, but it didn't erase the battles I had to fight daily just to be taken seriously. Invitations to scientific conferences still sometimes arrived addressed only to Pierre. Articles would refer to me as Madame Curie, assistant to her husband, as if I were holding the beakers while he made the discoveries. I had learned long ago not to waste energy on anger, but to channel it into proving, again and again, that my work spoke louder than prejudice. The Nobel Prize gave us visibility, but not wealth. Radium was extraordinarily expensive to produce, and we had no patents on our process. We believed science belonged to everyone, not just to those who could pay for it. That meant continuing to work in the same shabby lab, scraping by financially, and relying on sheer stubbornness to keep going. When Pierre was offered a professorship at the Sorbonne, it felt like a step forward. We thought it might mean more stability, but fate had other plans. In 1906, Pierre was struck by a horse-drawn cart in the streets of Paris and killed instantly. I can't describe that loss in neat sentences. For weeks, I moved through the world in a fog, the joy gone from my work. But one morning, I realized that stopping would mean losing him twice, once in life and once in legacy. So I stepped into his position at the Sorbonne, becoming its first female professor, and carried on our research alone. By then, I had already decided that science wasn't just about discovery, it was about service. The power of radium, I believed, could be harnessed for medicine, to shrink tumors and treat diseases. I wasn't just battling prejudice anymore. I was battling time, racing to make sure our discoveries helped the living before they could be forgotten. After Pierre's death, my life divided into two clear missions: raise my daughters and carry forward the work we had begun. It wasn't easy to do either, let alone both at once. I'd walk Irene and little Ave to school in the mornings, then head straight to the laboratory, where the silence without Pierre still felt like an open wound. But grief, I'd learned, could be a kind of fuel. I poured mine into science. Taking Pierre's professorship at the Sorbonne was daunting. Imagine walking into a lecture hall full of men in dark coats, all waiting for the new professor, and then watching their faces when they realized the professor was me. There was an almost audible pause, as if they weren't sure whether to take out their notebooks or their opera glasses. I started talking about radioactivity before anyone could object, filling the room with equations, measurements, and experiments. By the end of the hour, the stares had shifted from skepticism to something closer to respect. But my work wasn't confined to teaching. I was determined to make radium a tool for healing. By the early 1910s, doctors were using it to treat cancer, and I wanted to ensure it was available to as many patients as possible. The irony was that while I'd made one of the most valuable substances on Earth, I was still constantly strapped for funds. Radium was worth more than diamonds, and I had none of it for myself. Then, in 1914, the world tore itself apart. When the First World War began, I knew I couldn't stand by. I used my knowledge of X-rays to design mobile radiography units, little vans equipped with machines that could be driven to the front lines to locate shrapnel and bullets in wounded soldiers. I trained dozens of women, including my daughter Irene, to operate them. We became known as Les Petites Curies. Together, we traveled dangerous roads, set up our machines in makeshift tents, and helped save countless lives. Working so close to the battlefield was terrifying. Shells exploded in the distance, soldiers groaned on stretchers, and the air always smelled faintly of blood and disinfectant. But in those moments, I felt the purest sense of purpose I'd ever known. Science wasn't just about discovery. It was about compassion, about giving people a fighting chance. When the war ended, I turned my attention back to research and education. I traveled to the United States twice, not for leisure, but to raise funds for my Radium Institute in Paris. I shook hands, gave speeches, and even met President Harding, all to secure a single gram of radium for medical research. It was exhausting work, but worth it. By the 1920s, the Radium Institute was producing groundbreaking studies and training a new generation of scientists, many of them women who might never have had the chance without it. By then, the toll of my years in the lab was catching up to me. My eyesight weakened, my hands trembled, and my health began to fail. We didn't understand the dangers of prolonged radiation exposure in those early years, and I had spent decades surrounded by it, handling samples without gloves, carrying test tubes of glowing radium in my pockets. I knew it had damaged me, but I had no regrets. When I looked at my life's work, the discoveries of polonium and radium, 2 Nobel Prizes, the medical advances, the students I'd mentored, I knew I had kept my promise to the young girl in Warsaw who refused to stay quiet. I had shown, not just said, that a woman could stand among the greatest minds of her time. In my final years, I often thought about the barriers I'd faced: poverty, prejudice, isolation, and how each one had been a kind of test. The world had told me no in every possible way, and every time I'd found a way to turn that no into a new path forward. My daughters went on to live extraordinary lives. Irene even won her own Nobel Prize in chemistry. That, perhaps, was my greatest legacy. Not just what I discovered, but what I proved, that knowledge belongs to everyone, that curiosity is a form of courage, and that even the smallest voice can change the world if it refuses to be silenced. Summary and conclusion, 300 words. From a childhood in Russian-ruled Poland, where girls were told to keep their ambitions small, to the laboratories of Paris, my life was a chain of impossible steps. I studied in secret at Warsaw's underground flying university, saved every coin as a governess to help my sister and myself reach higher education, and endured poverty and isolation as I earned my degrees at the Sorbonne. Meeting Pierre was the start of a remarkable partnership. Together, in a damp and drafty shed, we discovered two new elements, polonium and radium, transforming the world's understanding of radioactivity. We shared the 1903 Nobel Prize in Physics, but the fight for recognition never ended. I lost Pierre far too soon, yet carried on alone, becoming the first woman professor at the Sorbonne and leading research that would bring hope to cancer patients. When war came, I left the lab for the battlefield, creating mobile X-ray units that saved thousands of soldiers' lives. Afterward, I built the Radium Institute, ensuring that the science we had fought so hard for would continue beyond my lifetime. I never patented my discoveries, believing science should be free for the benefit of humanity. That choice left me without wealth, but with something far greater, a legacy that could not be bought. If my story proves anything, it's that brilliance knows no gender, no nationality, and no limits, except those others try to impose. Break those limits, and the world changes.